Amira had been rejected 7 times before she turned 21. 7 men. 7 reasons why she wasn't good enough. But on the hottest day of that summer, when the richest rancher in 3 counties rode up to her cabin on his magnificent stallion, everything was about to change. The sun beat down on the wide-open prairie, casting a harsh glare over everything. Amira stood outside her weathered cabin, struggling with a heavy grain sack that seemed far too much for one woman to carry. The weight dug into her shoulders as her bare hands, already blistered from hours of labor, clutched at the rough fabric. Sweat trickled down her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she barely noticed. The heat was relentless, like the cruel weight of a lifetime of disappointments pressing down on her. Every step felt like a battle, not just with the grain, but with herself. She had learned to survive alone. Her family had abandoned her when she was barely a teenager, and the years since then had been full of struggles, both physical and emotional. The loneliness wasn't something she'd ever gotten used to, but it was something she'd learned to live with. Amira looked up at the barren landscape in front of her, the endless prairies stretching far into the horizon. The land was beautiful, yes, but it was harsh, just like her life. Maybe I was never meant to be chosen, she muttered to herself, setting the sack down and taking a deep breath. The thought haunted her, but she couldn't shake it. The town had always whispered about her, calling her the poor Amira, the girl no one wanted. 7 men had made sure of that. The first rejection had come when she was just 16. Thomas Blake, a handsome boy from the next town over, had asked her to the town dance. She had been nervous but excited, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would be her chance. But when he had pulled her onto the dance floor, he had looked her over and laughed. "You're too plain," he had said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words had sliced through her like a knife, and the shame had stayed with her long after the dance ended. William Hart, the son of a local merchant, had come next. She had attended a church social when she was 17, bringing her best dish, simple but made with care. But when she set it down on the table, he had turned up his nose. "A man needs a wife who can impress," he had said, "not embarrass." The words had burned through her, and she had never wanted to go to another church social again. At 18, the miller's son had shown her that love wasn't just about affection. It was about dowries and prospects. His family had refused to even consider her as a potential match. They had told her bluntly, no dowry, no prospects, and sent her away from their door with cold dismissal. By the time Samuel Greer had courted her at 19, Amira had convinced herself that maybe she wasn't meant for love. But for 2 months, Samuel had been kind, until he wasn't. He had chosen her cousin, the prettier and wealthier one, and the engagement announcement had come just days after he had broken her heart. The rejections had only gotten harsher after that. Robert Ashford, the rancher's son, had been crueler than the rest. "You're good for work, not for wearing on my arm," he had said when she had dared to hope he might see her as more than just someone to help on his ranch. The banker's nephew, who had come to town on a business trip when Amira was 20, had been even colder. He had heard about her family abandoning her, and had said, "I can't marry damaged goods." His words had stung like a slap in the face. And as he had walked away from her in the middle of the busy town square, Amira had felt the final blow to her spirit. The last and worst rejection had been from James Thornton, the one she had dared to hope would be different. He had proposed to her when she was 20, and for a moment, Amira had dared to believe she was finally worthy of love. But his mother had intervened, insisting that Amira was not good enough. He had chosen his mother over her, and the engagement was broken. Amira had stood there, humiliated, with the ring still on her finger as he walked away, leaving her standing in the dirt. Each rejection had left its mark. Each one had taught her that she wasn't enough, that she would always be second best. But somehow she had survived. Each wound had been a reminder that life wasn't kind to her, but she wasn't one to let it break her. Amira picked up the grain sack again, the weight heavier than ever. She had survived all of them, the 7 rejections, the whispers, the loneliness. But it didn't get any easier. Her hands were raw, her heart weary, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was destined to always be alone. That's when she heard it, the sound of hooves in the distance. A rider. She looked up, shading her eyes from the harsh sun. She squinted, trying to make out who it was. A man, dressed in fine clothes, riding a horse that looked like it belonged at a show. Her heart skipped a beat. Not another stranger to judge me, she thought, feeling her chest tighten with apprehension. The rider headed straight for her cabin, and Amira stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Could this man be different? Or was he just another person to remind her of her place in the world? The rider rode closer, and Amira braced herself for whatever came next. She learned not to hope. But hope, it seemed, wasn't asking her permission. As the rider drew closer, Amira's heart pounded, not with excitement, but with a familiar dread. The last thing she needed was another man who would look at her with pity, maybe even worse, one who might judge her as the others had. She steadied herself, wiped the sweat from her brow, and stood tall, determined not to appear weak. The man on the horse was different, though. She could see that. His posture was straight, and he didn't have the arrogance some of the others had shown. He was dressed in dark leather, the kind of clothes that suggested wealth. Yet there was something about him that didn't scream dandy or show off. He looked weathered, like someone who had spent years on the trail, his clothes worn but practical. His horse, too, was no mere showpiece. It was a magnificent animal, strong and muscular, with a glossy coat that gleamed in the sun. As he drew near, the dust rising around him, Amira caught sight of his face. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess her with a quiet, respectful observation. His face was roughened by years under the sun, with the kind of lines that spoke of hard work, not indulgence. This man wasn't the sort to look down on her, she could tell. He reined in his horse just a few feet away from her, and the powerful stallion stopped smoothly, almost as if it had been trained to do so. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he sat there for a moment, studying her. It made Amira uneasy, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Then, finally, the man spoke. "I'm Fritz Callahan," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. "And you are Miss Amira, I believe." His tone was polite, respectful, but there was no hesitation in the way he said it. He already knew who she was. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Amira nodded, but she didn't speak. She wasn't sure if she should. He continued. "I came to help you," he said simply, dismounting with a fluid grace that suggested he was used to doing such things. He didn't wait for her response, but went straight to the grain sack she had been struggling with earlier. Without asking, without hesitation, he picked it up as though it was nothing and carried it to the cabin for her. For a moment, Amira stood frozen, her mind spinning. This wasn't what she expected. She had imagined him offering some polite, condescending words, maybe a promise of charity, but he had done neither. He had simply helped. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words got stuck in her throat. She could hardly believe someone would just do something kind for her without an agenda. Fritz was already turning to leave, tipping his hat in a respectful gesture. "I'll be on my way now, Miss Amira," he said, giving her a small, genuine smile. "Take care." And with that, he was gone, riding off as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Amira standing there, still holding the dust of his presence in the air. She was confused. Was this some sort of charity work? Had he heard about her misfortune and decided to pity her? Or was there something else at play? Her heart ached at the thought of being pitied. She had grown used to that look in people's eyes, the one that saw her as a burden, a charity case, something to be avoided or ignored. But Fritz hadn't looked at her like that. It was as if he had seen her as an equal, as someone deserving of help without it diminishing her. And that confused her more than anything. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the help. It was the way he had done it. Quietly, respectfully, and without any expectation of reward. No man had ever treated her that way. Her thoughts raced as she made her way into town the next day for supplies. The gossip started almost immediately. Women whispered behind their hands when they saw her, their eyes darting in her direction. "Did you see that?" one of them murmured. "That was Fritz Callahan, wasn't it?" Another added. "He's the richest rancher in 3 counties. Why would he be helping her?" The words stung, but Amira didn't respond. She had learned long ago that the town's whispers meant little. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that Fritz's kindness might have been a fluke, an act of charity that he would soon forget. But what if it wasn't? She tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on her shopping, but the nagging questions wouldn't leave her. That evening, when she returned home, she found a bundle on her doorstep. Amira frowned, unsure whether to approach it. When she saw that it was wrapped in a clean cloth and smelled faintly of freshly baked bread, her heart skipped a beat. She opened it to find fresh bread, honey, and coffee, a simple, generous gesture. The same man who had helped her with the grain sack had left this for her. It was too much. He couldn't just leave things for her without explanation. Maybe this was his way of trying to help her, of giving her something she couldn't provide for herself. Maybe he thought she needed pity, but she didn't need his pity. She needed to be left alone. Still, she couldn't bring herself to throw the food away. She placed it inside, unsure what to make of it. The next morning, as Amira worked on the fence outside, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. She groaned, unsure whether to be irritated or grateful. Sure enough, it was Fritz Callahan. He was on horseback again, this time carrying a tool bag. He rode up to her property, dismounted, and went straight to the fence that needed fixing. He didn't ask for permission, didn't offer any explanations. He just started working. "Mr. Callahan, I don't need charity," Amira said, frustration creeping into her voice as she marched over to him. She wasn't used to this, men offering help without strings attached, without expecting anything in return. Fritz didn't look up from his work. "Good thing I'm not offering any," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "Then what is this?" Amira asked, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This is a fence that needs fixing," he said, still not looking at her, "and I know how to fix it." She stood there, stunned, her pride clashing with the absurdity of the situation. He wasn't asking anything of her. He wasn't trying to impress her or get anything from her. He was simply doing something she couldn't do on her own. And, despite herself, she realized she was starting to feel something shift inside her, something she didn't want to acknowledge. Fritz finished his work and nodded at her, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I'll be going now, Miss Amira," he said, tipping his hat once more. "Take care." Amira stood there, watching him ride away, still caught in the whirlwind of her emotions. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. What then? And why did she feel like, for the first time in years, someone had actually seen her for who she was, not for what she lacked? The next morning, Amira found a bundle of fresh bread, honey, and coffee on her doorstep once more, and this time, a note tucked inside. "You deserve more than what the world has given you." He didn't court her with words. He courted her with presence. Amira couldn't quite explain it, but something about the way Fritz Callahan moved around her made her feel like she was the most important person in the world. He didn't speak much, just enough to be respectful, but his actions spoke louder than anything words could convey. Over the next few weeks, Fritz came by her cabin regularly, though always without fanfare and always with something to offer. A broken fence here, a leaking roof there. Each time, he appeared without asking, as if he already knew what needed to be done. Amira wasn't sure whether to be irritated or grateful. At first, she was stubborn, wanted to push him away, to send him back to his fine ranch where he belonged. But as the days passed, something inside her softened. He never lingered longer than necessary, always leaving before the awkwardness could settle in. But each time, something changed in her. He left a little piece of himself behind, whether it was a tool, a bag of vegetables, or once a beautifully knitted shawl that he had brought from town. The shawl was soft, warm and simple, but to Amira, it felt like more than just an item of clothing. It felt like a gesture, a sign that Fritz saw her. In a world that had always dismissed her, that acknowledgement meant everything. She didn't know what to make of it, but her heart began to stir in ways she hadn't expected. Slowly, she found herself looking forward to his visits, even if only for the brief moments he was there. But as much as she appreciated his silent help, doubts began to creep in. Why was he doing this? What did he want from her? Her pride told her to turn him away, to remind him that she didn't need saving, that she didn't need his pity. After all, men like him didn't fall for women like her. They were supposed to see her as no more than a poor, abandoned girl, someone to be ignored or forgotten. Yet here Fritz was, week after week, doing things for her without asking for anything in return. She told herself she wasn't interested, that she wasn't going to let herself be fooled again. But the more time she spent with him, the more confused she became. He saw her, really saw her, something no one else had done. It was a feeling both beautiful and terrifying, a mixture of hope and fear that twisted in her chest. One scorching afternoon, as the summer heat bore down, Amira stood at the edge of her well, her hands aching from hours of trying to dig deeper to find water. The heat had drained all her strength, and the task was proving impossible. The well had been running dry for days, and now it was barely a trickle, threatening to leave her without water for the coming weeks. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and as she stood there, hands on her hips, staring at the dry well, she almost felt like giving up. But then, a familiar sound echoed in the distance, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the dry ground. She turned, half expecting to see Fritz's figure silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Sure enough, there he was, riding toward her as calm and steady as ever. Without a word, he dismounted, his boots landing lightly on the dusty earth. He assessed the situation in silence before walking over to her. "May I?" he asked simply, motioning toward the well. Amira looked at him, caught off guard. She was about to protest, to remind him that she could handle it, but the words didn't come. She was too tired, too grateful. With a nod, she stepped back. He didn't wait for her permission. Instead, he moved toward the well with an ease that spoke of years of experience. He worked efficiently, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Amira watched as he pulled out the ropes and pulleys, setting them up with a practiced hand. The sound of their work filled the air, the rhythmic scrape of shovels, the occasional grunt of exertion, and the quiet, steady rhythm of breath. The air was thick with the tension of the summer heat, but with Fritz beside her, the world seemed a little more bearable. Then, after what felt like hours, there was a satisfying noise, the splash of water. Fritz had struck water, and as he pulled the bucket up, Amira couldn't contain the breath of relief that escaped her lips. They both stood there for a moment, staring at the water in the bucket, the sweat dripping from their brows. And then, without thinking, they both laughed, loud and genuine, the kind of laughter that comes from relief and shared triumph. It was the first real connection she'd felt in years, and for a fleeting moment, Amira forgot about all the rejections, the loneliness, the hurt. There was just this moment, this feeling of being seen, of having someone beside her who wasn't going to leave. It was a small thing, but it meant more to her than anything she'd ever known. "You're stronger than you know, Miss Amira," Fritz said, his voice low but steady. The words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Amira allowed herself to believe them. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, not in a way that felt real. The men she had known in the past had never seen her as strong, only as something to be fixed, something to be worked around. But Fritz, this man who had every reason to treat her with distance, had just seen her for who she was. She swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Fritz didn't seem to notice the tremor in her voice. He simply smiled, his eyes warm with something she couldn't quite name. He loaded the bucket onto the wagon and turned to leave, but not before giving her one last look. "I'll see you soon, Miss Amira," he said, and with that, he was gone, leaving her alone with the water, the sunset, and the quiet stirrings of something she wasn't ready to name. The quiet gift of respect, the silent courtship had begun. But what did it mean? Was it the beginning of something real? Or was it simply another kindness she didn't deserve? Amira stood there for a long time, staring after him, wondering if she was ready to let someone into her heart again. Sometimes it takes a storm to wash away the lies we tell ourselves. The day the storm arrived, it came like a warning. Dark clouds swirled in the sky, thick and ominous, swallowing up the light. The wind picked up, harsh and unforgiving, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Amira looked out from her porch, the horizon darkening with every passing minute, and she knew it was coming. She had seen enough storms in her life to recognize their signs. The chickens scattered, clucking in panic, and the shutters on her cabin rattled in their frames. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her, her heart racing. The cabin was small and simple, but she had always taken pride in it. It had been her refuge when the world had turned its back on her, a place where she could retreat from the harshness of life. As the wind howled, she tried to secure the shutters, but the storm was already upon her. She cursed under her breath, struggling to hold them in place, but the howling wind pushed back with fierce determination. She was alone again. The fear that had always lingered at the edges of her mind came rushing back with the storm. She felt helpless, vulnerable, just like she had in all those years when rejection had been the only thing she had known. But then, through the roar of the wind, she heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. The sound of hooves. Her heart leaped in her chest. Fritz! She didn't know why she thought it was him, but she did. She rushed to the door and opened it just as he rode up, his silhouette framed by the storm's fury. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he dismounted, his movements swift and purposeful. The rain had started to pour in sheets, cold and relentless, soaking both of them in an instant. Amira couldn't help but stare at him. His face was grim but determined, as though he had come for something more than just to weather the storm. He was here, with no questions, no hesitation. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the howling wind. It wasn't the first time he had said those words, but this time, something in the way he said it made Amira feel as though it was true. He wasn't just offering help. He was offering protection, a promise that she wouldn't have to face this storm alone. He worked with quiet efficiency, helping her secure the cabin against the fierce wind. Together, they moved the animals to the barn, their bodies pressed close as they struggled against the wind, neither of them speaking much, but their movements coordinated, a shared purpose binding them. It was as if they had known each other for years, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Amira was stunned by how seamlessly they worked together, how his presence grounded her in a way no one else ever had. She didn't realize how much she had been holding back until that moment. Holding back not just from him, but from herself. With every movement, every word, every glance, Fritz was showing her that there was more to life than the rejection and loneliness she had grown used to. He was showing her that maybe, just maybe, she was worth something more than just surviving. Once the animals were safe, they retreated to the cabin, the storm raging outside. Amira moved to make a fire, but Fritz stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Let me," he said softly. There was no urgency in his voice, just calm. It made her heart tighten in her chest. He wasn't here to impose. He wasn't here to make her feel small. He was simply here, present in the moment, offering what he could. As the fire crackled and warmth spread through the cabin, they both sat in silence, listening to the storm's fury outside. Amira's heart felt lighter than it had in days, the quiet company of Fritz filling the empty spaces she had become so accustomed to. The storm outside matched the turmoil inside her, a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like the girl who had been abandoned, the girl who had been rejected. For once, she felt like someone saw her, really saw her, not just as a piece of land to be worked or a girl to be pitted, but as a person, a woman who had endured, a woman who had strength, a woman who was worthy of something more. As the storm raged outside, Amira couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment everything was about to change. Fritz was still sitting by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light, his gaze steady and warm. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. It was more than gratitude for his kindness, more than the shared silence. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel like she wasn't just a woman to be pitied, but a woman to be respected, to be cherished. But the fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind. What if this was just another fleeting kindness? What if he left, just like all the others had? What if she opened her heart only to find it shattered again? She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to need him, but the truth was she did. She needed him in a way she hadn't needed anyone in years. But how could she let herself trust that? How could she let herself hope when hope had so often led her astray? Fritz, sensing the shift in the air, looked at her with a quiet intensity. "Amira," he said, his voice low, "you don't have to say anything. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just here, just for you. Whatever happens, I'll be here whether you need me or not." His words, simple and direct, hit her harder than anything he had said before. And for the first time in years, Amira allowed herself to believe them. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. Fritz Callahan wasn't like the others. He wasn't here to use her or to leave her. He was here because, in some quiet, unspoken way, he had chosen her. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, for the first time, Amira felt something shift within her, something fragile but real. And as Fritz rose to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at her, his eyes filled with unspoken words. "I'll see you soon, Amira," he said softly. Soon, for the first time in her life, Amira was being courted. And this time, she knew her worth. Fritz Callahan had slowly but surely changed everything she thought she knew about love, respect, and herself. It started with little things, small gestures that didn't need to be grand, but every time he came by, she felt something shift inside her. At first, she resisted, told herself she didn't need anyone, that she could survive alone as she always had. But his presence, his steady, respectful presence, made it impossible to deny the truth anymore. He wasn't like the others. Fritz didn't see her as someone who needed saving, or as someone who would simply fulfill some empty role in his life. He saw her for what she truly was, a woman of strength, dignity, and worth. It had been weeks since that stormy night, and since then, Fritz's visits had become regular, almost like a steady rhythm Amira had come to rely on. It wasn't that she expected him to solve her problems, but the way he treated her. Every visit, every quiet word, made her realize how little she had been seen by the people around her. Fritz wasn't a man of many words, but he didn't need to be. His actions spoke for him. He brought her flowers from the prairie, simple wildflowers, but the thought behind them made Amira feel something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being valued, of being worth something. He didn't try to impress her with words or wealth. He simply came to listen, to be present. He wasn't asking anything from her. He was offering everything he had, with no strings attached. It was bewildering and freeing all at once. And it scared her more than she wanted to admit. As days passed, Fritz began to court her properly, as any respectable man would. He started coming to her cabin on Sundays, when the weather was fair, wearing his best clothes, bringing food he had cooked himself, and sitting down with her on the porch, talking about his ranch, about life, about what they each wanted in the world. It was the first time someone had truly listened to her, and with each conversation, Amira's walls slowly began to crumble. The woman who had once resigned herself to a life of solitude now found herself daring to dream. But with each gesture, each word from Fritz, Amira felt the weight of her past creeping in. She had been rejected by 7 men. 7 times she had been told she wasn't good enough. 7 wounds that had shaped her view of herself, and she wasn't sure how to let go of them. She feared that Fritz might, one day, see her as the others had, too plain, too poor, too broken. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized that Fritz didn't care about the things that had mattered to the men who had rejected her. He didn't care about dowries, family status, or even appearances. He cared about her. She saw in the way he looked at her, in the way he never hurried her, never pushed her to be anything other than herself. Amira had never known a love like that, one that wasn't based on conditions or expectations. The past rejections had left deep scars, but Fritz, in his quiet, unassuming way, was helping her heal. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch after a long day of work, he turned to her and asked, "What do you want, Amira?" His question was simple, but it struck her to the core. What did she want? For so long, she had lived in survival mode, pushing forward without ever allowing herself to dream. She had always believed that she wasn't allowed to want, that her role was to accept whatever came her way, no matter how little. But Fritz was asking her what she wanted, not just what she needed. And in that moment, she realized how much she had been denying herself. She had wanted so many things: love, respect, companionship. But she had buried those desires under layers of fear, rejection, and shame. Fritz wasn't asking her to change who she was. He was asking her to acknowledge her own worth, to allow herself the freedom to desire more. The words came out before she even realized it. "I want a life where I am seen for who I truly am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want someone who will respect me, stand by me, not because of what I can give them, but because of who I am." Fritz didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that went deeper than words. He had always known her worth. He had always seen her for what she was, even when she hadn't been able to see it herself. And that, more than anything, was what made him different. The next few days were a whirlwind of quiet moments and shared laughter. Fritz continued to court her, asking her about her dreams, her life, the things that made her smile. For the first time, Amira found herself opening up in ways she had never done before. She shared her fears, her hopes, and even her doubts. And through it all, Fritz listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. His unwavering support, his gentle nature, was a balm to her soul. But the town was still watching. Amira couldn't forget that. The whispers hadn't stopped, and the judgment from others still stung. The women in town spoke of her behind closed doors, their gossip like a shadow that followed her everywhere. "He's just playing with her," one woman said. "It's a game for him. She'll be forgotten as soon as he gets bored." Another woman added, "He's got his eyes on someone else. Mark my words." Every time Amira overheard those words, it felt like another wound being opened. It was hard to believe that someone as good as Fritz could truly care for her, when so many others had never seen her for anything more than what she lacked. And then, one evening, as she was sitting by the fire, Fritz came by again, carrying a simple but beautiful ribbon, the color of the prairie grass. "I saw this in town," he said, his voice calm and steady, "and it reminded me of your eyes. The color of new wheat, strong and growing." Amira's heart stilled. No one had ever noticed her eyes before, let alone given her something so personal. She took the ribbon from him, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, but it was more than just gratitude. It was a recognition of something she had never allowed herself to believe, that she was worthy of being noticed, of being cared for. And in that moment, she knew that Fritz wasn't like the others. He had never judged her. He had never asked her to be anything she wasn't. He had simply seen her, and he cared for her in a way that was genuine, unwavering, and real. But as the town's whispers grew louder, Amira couldn't shake the fear that, in the end, all this would be too good to be true. Would Fritz stay, or would he leave, just like all the others? She'd spent her life waiting to be chosen. Now she had to choose fear or faith. The days following Fritz's last visit were filled with uncertainty, an uneasy tension settling deep in Amira's chest. She couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that the quiet, steady affection she had come to rely on might slip away like everything else in her life. Fritz had become her anchor, the person who made her feel seen, respected, and worthy of something more than the broken promises and cruel words of her past. But the storm inside her heart hadn't fully settled. Every kind gesture, every word of encouragement, still seemed too good to be true, and the whispers from town, the gossips, the doubts, never stopped. Every time she walked into town, the women would look her up and down, their conversations abruptly halting when she passed. Amira couldn't help but overhear their murmurs. "She'll get her heart broken soon enough," one woman had said. "What could he possibly see in her?" Another added, her voice full of judgment. The words stung, but Amira had learned to ignore them. Or at least she thought she had. Deep down, they planted seeds of doubt that were hard to shake. She had been rejected so many times, been made to feel like she was never good enough, that it was difficult to imagine that Fritz could really want her. Maybe, in the end, she was just a passing fancy to him, a novelty, a kind woman to help for a while before moving on to someone more suitable. These were the thoughts that plagued her mind as she worked around her cabin one afternoon, gathering firewood, when a familiar sound broke through her quiet reflection. Hooves. She froze, her heart skipping in her chest. She didn't need to look to know who it was. James Thornton. Her heart sank. The last man who had rejected her, the one who had shattered her belief in love, was standing before her again. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, and she had prayed she never would. He had come to apologize once before, but the words felt empty then, and they felt even emptier now. He had left her broken, humiliated, and yet here he was, standing on her doorstep, asking for another chance. "Amira," he began, his voice carrying that same familiar charm, "I made a mistake. You were right, and I was wrong. Please, I beg you to reconsider. We can start over." His eyes were pleading, the same eyes that once filled her with hope before tearing her apart. She could feel her breath catch in her throat. The temptation to fall back into old patterns, to take the safe, familiar route, was strong. Her past had been full of hurt, and this offer from James seemed like a chance to undo all the pain, a chance to be chosen, to be seen by someone who had once promised her the world. But the truth hit her harder than any words. This was not the man who had seen her for who she was, who had valued her for her strength, her resilience. That man was Fritz, and in that moment, she knew that James's apology didn't matter anymore. She had learned to stop seeking validation from those who couldn't see her. She had learned to stop believing in empty promises and fleeting affection. "No, James," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I won't make the same mistake again. You had your chance, and you chose someone else. You chose to listen to your mother, to put her before me, and I will never be second to anyone again." James's face twisted in surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to be so resolute. But he began, but she interrupted him, her voice sharper now. "You chose comfort over courage. You didn't see me, and you didn't deserve me." The words felt like a weight lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, Amira had chosen herself. She had chosen her own worth over the fear of being alone, over the temptation of someone else's affection. The quiet, confident strength that had been growing in her over the past weeks rose up like a wave, pushing away the remnants of doubt and fear that had once controlled her. "I don't need you, James," she continued, her heart swelling with a sense of liberation she had never known. I don't need anyone who doesn't see me for who I am. Not you, not anyone. I'm enough on my own." James's face darkened, the disappointment evident in his eyes. Without a word, he turned and mounted his horse, riding off without a second glance. Amira watched him go, the last thread of her old life unraveling before her eyes. For the first time, she felt a sense of freedom, of independence she had never imagined she could have. She was standing in the ashes of a past that no longer had any power over her. And just as that realization settled in, she heard the sound of hooves again, and this time her heart leapt in her chest. Fritz! He had returned. Amira turned to face him, her heart racing, unsure of what to expect. But as he rode toward her, she saw in his eyes quiet, steady affection, not bound by obligation or pity, but rooted in something real. He dismounted and walked toward her, his eyes locking with hers. "Amira," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I didn't mean to leave you wondering." Amira smiled, the weight of everything that had been holding her back finally lifting. "You didn't have to come back," she said, her voice full of conviction. "But I'm glad you did." Fritz looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady and warm. "Amira," he said again, his voice low, "I'll always come back for you." The promise in his words filled the empty space in her heart, a space that had once been filled with fear and uncertainty. But now it was filled with something new, trust. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, Amira realized that her choice was clear. She wasn't waiting for anyone to choose her anymore. She had already chosen herself. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. As Fritz reached for her hand, a sense of peace settled over her. She wasn't alone anymore. And this time, it was because she had chosen herself. Amira had been rejected 7 times. The 8th time, she chose herself and found love waiting. The preparations for the wedding came fast, as did the realization that for the first time, Amira was allowing herself to truly embrace the love and respect Fritz offered her. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a fantasy ending. It was something real, something earned, and something deeply rooted in both their lives. Fritz's gentle persistence had given her space to heal, to reclaim her own sense of worth. And now, they were preparing for the next step. But the process wasn't without its challenges. The county was still talking, the whispers never far behind, but Amira didn't care anymore. She was no longer the girl who had spent years being dismissed or rejected by men who didn't see her value. She was the woman who had chosen herself and had found someone who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. The wedding was to be held at Fritz's ranch, the largest venue in the area, a grand affair that would bring the entire community together, especially the 7 men who had once rejected her. It was no coincidence that Fritz had insisted on this venue. He wanted to make sure that everyone knew that Amira wasn't just a woman to be pitied or overlooked. She was a woman to be celebrated. The week before the wedding, the town was abuzz with speculation. Amira could feel the tension in the air as she moved through her daily tasks. The women still whispered behind their hands, their disapproval and curiosity palpable. "I don't know what he sees in her," one woman said as Amira passed by her in the general store. "What could he possibly want with a woman like that?" another whispered. But Amira had stopped hearing their words. She was no longer the object of their judgment. She had learned to stand tall, to let their words fall away like leaves in the wind. The day before the wedding, the 7 men who had once rejected her gathered in town. They were there for the wedding, whether they liked it or not, and Amira could feel the weight of their presence, each of them witnessing the woman she had become. There was Robert Ashford, the rancher's son who had once dismissed her as good for work, not for wearing on my arm, now standing in the corner, shifting uncomfortably as he watched Amira walk past. Samuel Greer, the man who had chosen her cousin over her, had his head down, clearly embarrassed by his past actions. Even James Thornton, the man who had left her broken-hearted and humiliated, was there, his eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. But it was Thomas Blake who caught her attention the most. He had once called her too plain, but now, as he watched her, there was something different in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the realization that he had missed out on something far more precious than he had ever understood. Fritz noticed this shift in the air too. As the reception began, and Amira and Fritz danced together for the first time as a couple, he held her close, his hand steady at the small of her back. The entire room fell silent when they entered. Every eye trained on them, as if they were witnessing something extraordinary. And in that moment, Amira realized they were. She wasn't the girl who had once cowered under the weight of rejection. She wasn't the woman who had been defined by other people's opinions of her. She was the woman who had learned to choose herself, to stand tall, and to recognize her own worth. And Fritz, standing beside her, was the man who had always seen that in her. They moved together in perfect harmony, her heart beating in time with his, and for the first time in her life, she danced with complete freedom. She wasn't bound by the judgments of the past or the expectations of others. She was free. As the dance continued, Amira's eyes met the 7 men who had once rejected her. They stood at the edges of the room, watching her with a mixture of awe and regret. James Thornton, the most ashamed of them all, stepped forward, his voice trembling as he said, "Amira, I was wrong. If you'll give me another chance, His voice trailed off, but Fritz stepped forward, his hand firmly placed on Amira's shoulder. "She doesn't give second chances to men who didn't value the first," Fritz said, his voice low and steady. "You had your chance, Thornton." Amira felt a surge of power in that moment. She didn't need to explain herself or defend her choices. Fritz had said it for her. She had chosen herself, and that was all that mattered. "He's right," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I don't, and I won't." The words felt like freedom, a final closing of the door to the past. James turned and walked away, his face red with shame, but Amira didn't feel anger. She didn't feel resentment. She simply felt free. As the evening went on, the gossips in the room continued to murmur, but their words had no power over her. With Fritz by her side, she didn't need their approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had everything she needed. She was enough. After the reception, Fritz took her aside, his eyes filled with affection. "I have a gift for you," he said, leading her to a building on his ranch that she hadn't noticed before. "Your cabin was your refuge. But you need more than just refuge. You need a place to grow." He opened the door to reveal a beautiful studio, a space for her to create, to learn, and to build. "This is yours," he said, "always yours." Amira stood in the doorway, overwhelmed with emotion. "You built this for me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "For us." Fritz corrected her gently. "You're not alone in this. We're building something together." It was the final piece, the final confirmation of what she had known all along. Fritz didn't see her as someone to be rescued. He saw her as his equal, his partner. They had built something together, a love founded on respect, trust, and shared dreams. And now, as she stood beside him, she realized that the journey of healing and self-discovery she had begun so many months ago had led her here to this moment. A new life, a new beginning, and the freedom to choose her own path. The wedding plans were set, the entire town invited, and the guests were already arriving. But for Amira, the true celebration had already begun. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had found the love that had been waiting for her all along.